Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Records Management Essentials for Business Analysts. I'm your host, Liva Randribasson, and on behalf of IIBA, thanks for joining us today. Today's webinar is a public event. It is designed to deliver practical resources for you as you continue to grow your skill set and deliver value within your organization. When you join IIBA, you become a member of an international association dedicated to developing and promoting the business analysis profession. Your IIBA membership gives you access to a vibrant BA community and resources to support your development and career growth. IIBA is a non-profit professional association serving the growing field of business analysis. And our goal is to unite a community of professionals to create better business outcomes. As the global thought leader and voice of the business analysis community, IIBA works to maintain global standards for the ongoing development of the practice and certifications. And this webinar today is brought to you by Laserfiche. Laserfiche is the leading global provider of intelligent content management and business process automation. Through powerful workflows, electronic forms, document management, and analytics, the Laserfiche platform eliminates manual processes and automates repetitive tasks, accelerating how business gets done. And we would like to thank Laserfiche for supporting IIBA and the business analysis community. Today's presenter is Anita Chang. Anita Chang is a pre-sales manager, and she comes from Long Beach, California, where she leads a team of engineers who help customers envision how they can improve their existing document and records-driven business processes with Laserfiche. And you can find her sharing product knowledge with end users and solution providers alike on webinars, trainings, trade shows, and conferences. Welcome, Anita.
Thank you, Liva. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And just to confirm, is the screen showing?
Yes, it is.
All right, thank you. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks again for that introduction. I'm here today to talk about records management for business analysts. And like Liva mentioned, my name is Anita Chang. I'm a pre-sales manager at Laserfiche. And some of you may be wondering why someone with that title is here to talk about business analysis today. And I wanted to provide a little bit of context about why I'm here. In my role, I do work with many business analysts who do work with Laserfiche in order to identify areas that they can improve their processes, as well as records management components and how they're working with documents today. So I do get the opportunity to see a lot of existing processes and suggest how we can make them better. And just so you know a little bit more about the context of where I'm coming from, like Liva mentioned, Laserfiche is a lot of different things, but today I'll be focusing on some of the aspects that include document management and process automation, as well as our Department of Defense 5015.2 certified records management component. We offer self-hosted platforms as well as a software as a service cloud offering based in AWS in both the United States and Canada. And so there are a lot of different ways that we've implemented records management, and hopefully we can share that information with you. Now, generally, how I'm going to go through the different topics in this presentation are to first outline what records management even is. As a business analyst, you might have some exposure to records management already, but my goal is to frame it in a way that makes it directly applicable to your own role and position. So what is records management anyway? Well, according to ISO 15489-1, it's a pretty broad and general practice. So with the definition of records management itself, we can see that it is responsible for the efficient and systematic control of the creation, receipt, maintenance, use, and disposition of records, so on and so forth, right? The key parts of this definition let us know that for records management, we're interested in not only when something is created, but managing the entire record through the point that we start using this record, we receive it, we have to keep track of it, all the way through we go through the disposition. So that's a whole life cycle for a record, which we'll talk about in a second. The other half of this definition that I find interesting is that the key part of how we define something as a record is whether it's information or evidence for our business activities and transactions. So by default, this is something that is a really broad general sense of the business landscape. A record can be a document, it can be a piece of data. It's something that just encapsulates information about our business transactions. So that can mean a lot of different things to different people. So I'm not going to repeat this definition for every time I talk about records management. It's a pretty lengthy, academic sounding definition of what it is that we're working with. But in general, we can think of records management as the general practice of managing those records from that creation point to disposal. And like I mentioned, a record is anything whose lifespan is governed by those specific rules. And if we think back to that ISO definition, a record is not only something that is governed, but offers value to a business because it provides evidence of a transaction. So that can mean, again, many things. When I say life cycle, this is really anything that has to happen to this record after it's created. So whether it's an automatic creation or someone is drafting a document, the life cycle for a record will be defined by its usefulness and how long we need to keep something and what we're going to do with the record at the end of that time point. Now, the key thing with records management is that it's a practice that is often driven by the need to comply with external or internal policies. So the key here is that it's in place because we need to capture and maintain that evidence. And sometimes that policy comes from our external forces, like government regulation being a very key part of that. But it can also be an internal practice. Either way, records management is something that exists because we all know the issue of not keeping something for long enough and not being able to find that information again, or not being able to find it and keeping things for too long and just having them within our system. Now, a more concrete example of records management as a general practice can be found in a very specific regulation. Let's talk about SEC Rule 17A4. So if you're not in the financial services industry, this might be foreign to you, but this is an example of an external policy that determines records management practices for a specific subset of businesses. In our case, broker-dealers that have client files, account documents, policies, and procedures for how they deal with financial information for their customers. SEC rule regulates how long documents are supposed to be kept. There are outlines for specific document types and what you are supposed to do with each of them. This also outlines how long where storage is actually supposed to be kept. So for these types of documents, it's important to keep them on worm storage, which is write once, read many. So that dictates not only how long we're keeping these records, but where we need to store them. And not only do we outline a policy from the government for how we're supposed to keep these records, but there are also heavy penalties for violation. So there's a lot of incentives to make sure as a broker-dealer that I'm following these records management policies that are outlined by this external force. So what we've seen in terms of broker-dealers responding to this is putting into place a solution that not only automates some of those business practices like opening up accounts, but also finding ways to apply records retention policies to documents as they are filed. So we don't need to think about each individual document type as they're getting created, but also by enforcing compliance through software security features in order to make sure people are not tampering with records, and leveraging audit logs that are built into the software to actually track user access. So on the first slide, we talked about how we're actually seeing the information that's required from our SEC Rule 17A4 and how that pans out into a records management practice for an organization that's subject to it. Now, not all of us here are broker dealers, I assume, or working within the financial services industry. But for every industry out there, there are many, many parallels to why we want to keep that information to prove compliance. So as a business analyst, there's a lot of different areas in records management that directly apply to your practice. So for records management and business analysis, even if you aren't someone who is involved directly in the records management enforcement of your organization, I do want to point out that this is a very natural fit. So in analyzing business processes, records management is actually a native part of basically every process. So the key that I point out here is that in every procedure, you are still deciding whether something is or is not a record. Is it important evidence of a business transaction that needs to be kept? Is it subject to specific rules? By outlining that thought while you're analyzing a business process, you are already taking a records management standpoint. And that's because in every process, virtually every process at least, we have content that is generated. So you might have forms that are submitted, you may have things that go through approval that you need to track the approval decisions for. You're collecting data by default, and you want to keep the metadata that's indexed that with the submissions that's being collected. And you also are keeping track of who is able to access these processes that are currently being built. So even when you begin analyzing a business process, no matter what industry you're in, you are inherently making records management decisions because you are deciding whether or not something is or is not something that you need to keep for a long time. So what that means for you as a business analyst is that you are going to use those business analyst skills to gather requirements. In records management can be part of a process, or it can be a process in and of itself, right? Because there are ways that we can identify places that we can improve the ways that we are collecting this information to manage later. We need to actually collect necessary data points to apply the records management policies themselves, so that bakes into the requirements gathering portion of any business process. And you're also going to be anticipating those needs to report on whether you're complying with those records management policies, even if this builds into a larger business process. So as a business analyst, you're already possessing those skills. It's a very natural fit because you're going to use this sort of information to do things like create a business requirements document to convey both the regulatory needs and the end user ones. So for records management in particular, I think it's a very important skill set that belongs in every process, whether it's called records management or not, or whether you're focusing on a process as a business analyst for someone specifically in a compliance role, or whether you're dealing with general business users who just want to make sure their process feeds into larger compliance practice of your organization. Now, as a business analyst, you are also generally coming from an IT standpoint. So in analyzing your business process, you'll also be equipped to align a records management policy with IT decisions that are being made. So that looks like choosing a technology platform that actually provides the tools built into it that allow your records managers and your end users to access your content in the ways that they'd like, as well as identifying where your current records are. Now, because people don't naturally think of everything as a record, or they're holding on to too much content at once, there are a lot of different places that your records could be living within your organization, especially if you're getting started on a digital transformation process and you haven't centralized everything yet. So being able to inventory and identify your current systems of record is going to be important in your role as a business analyst. And it is unique because you sit in between those business users and the IT infrastructure as a whole. Now, this also means that when you're determining your approach, this allows you to leverage the requirements that you gather and the pain points that you're trying to solve to potentially manage an approach with multiple areas of record storage. And that could be a decision that you are going to make, whether you're going to have a central record storage system or if things are going to be more of a federated approach. So in these conversations, when you're analyzing business processes, as well as collecting the requirements that need to be taken care of by an improved process, you will probably have to align your knowledge of the business process itself with the different systems that are available to you or that you're procuring. Now, the other part of this, I think that is kind of a tag along to records management being inherent in almost every business process, is that records management stakeholders are going to be a silent participant in everything. So if we take the approach of thinking about records management as native to every process, then we're also assuming that there's another stakeholder on our stakeholder map. Sometimes those compliance teams within your organizations are very proactive and they're people that you work with regularly. Other times a compliance team isn't maybe something that exists within your own particular organization. But in thinking about records management, you are basically implying that there is another stakeholder, which is the compliance team that cares about different items than a business user in your business process. So this is particularly relevant if you have a business process that generates content, collects data, and routes things for indexing into a data repository that's not purposely built just for records management users. It's for business end case. It might be something like contract management or invoice approval. So many different examples of business processes that are inherently going to create content that needs to be managed as a record. But for our end users, they're not necessarily thinking about all of the different content that would be required to generate a retention policy and schedule, whether they're going to classify it in a way that is easy for a records management team to look at. So as a business analyst, you have to keep the records management stakeholder in the back of your mind as well. So what do they care about? They, of course, care about classifying content in a way that allows us to apply our retention policies in a very consistent manner. Whether we're going to be able to place holds, which is something we'll talk about in just a moment, and find that content in terms of going back in for e-discovery through a litigation process or audit, whether we're going to be able to track who has touched our content or who has made those approval decisions. And in general, this is something that everyone is invested in, but being able to find our content later. So you can see that there are some overlapping interests between our compliance team stakeholder and what we would generally think of as our business unit that is driving the change behind their process. But there are other needs that in only talking to the sponsor of our project, if they're on a business team that is not records management, you might lose out on some of the information that you would need to also make our silent RM stakeholders happy. So again, this means that you have process changes that you might be making that don't necessarily take records management into consideration if we don't consider the records management stakeholders from the beginning, or at least consult them as part of our process. We do find a lot of times when we're going through a project, they may not be the initial drivers of the change for the process that we're working on, but they are people who are deeply invested in the outcome. So for records management folks, that's also another consideration, is that they may be working with the same content that your process is generating, but they may not care about seeing it in the same way. It's more of an archival standpoint, ensuring that things are proceeding through their retention policies along the same times. So for our records management stakeholders, they are kind of a special unit that may not be people that you are natively reaching out to as part of your discovery and requirements process at first. The other side of being a business analyst and how it has to do with records management is really the change management portion. So this is true of any process you've probably ever worked on as a business analyst. Records management in particular asks people to take a look at something that they might find boring or they might not be invested in because it's not some business need that they're immediately concerned with. Again, it's our stakeholder that sits in our records management compliance side of things that really cares about enforcing this. So enforcing records management or building it into a process natively is something that can take a little bit of adjustment, because this may mean that you have updated procedures as part of your business process. We might not be comfortable anymore with just throwing everything into the same folder and calling it a day. We want to make sure that we're archiving content with the right indexing information, making it easier to find later, standardizing naming convention and file structure as well. Things that are as fundamental as that may be an adjustment to how our business users are working with our content. The other half of this that is usually more of the challenge that we see is that for records managers, it's not as foreign of a concept to know that we need to get rid of content as well. But for our business users, we do have our people who are more conservative in this regard. They might feel the need to hold on to information forever. And that's not necessarily a good thing for a multitude of reasons. So one of the largest areas of change management that we see in embarking on modernizing a process where the inherent drivers of the process are not the records management team is that we have people on the business side of things who may not be comfortable letting go of information or duplicates of information, but that makes the records management portion harder. So that's one thing to consider, is that change management, of course, is an aspect of every single thing you're dealing with as a business analyst. It is very native to your role. But what we'll do now is talk a little bit about these words I've been using and throwing out there to manage records so that you have some idea of the subject matter that you're dealing with, and it allows you to be a member of those conversations and talk about the data points that you need to collect to make sure that records management policies are enforced. So to return to the idea of a life cycle here, we initially talked about a life cycle as just whatever happens to a record from the time that we create it to the time that we get rid of it in some manner. And there is a general accepted practice for what a record goes through in terms of the stages that it needs to flow through from beginning to end. So when we consider a record to be active, this is probably pretty intuitive. When a record is active, it's currently in use. We're actively changing that document. It could be data. We're working with it. We're re-indexing it. We're putting it through processes, something that remains a live form of content. And we're used to working with our content in an active phase. But at some point in the record life cycle, the part that defines the rest of the life cycle is actually this middle point of cutoff. And what a cutoff point is it's something that defines when a record is no longer active, no longer when we're actively changing pieces within it, changing the process that it's going through, constructing any of the actual data that's within this record. And it goes into this retention stage. Now, the cutoff point is just a point in between these two stages. We have active stage, retention stage. Cutoff is not a stage, but rather an indicator that our record is no longer active and it's time to move into our next stage, which we call retention. Now, in traditional records management, retention is just simply how long we are holding a record for. So in terms of policies, you'll usually see things that say, you need to keep a record for 6 years. Now, there's a lot of ways to break that down, but just inherently, the retention for that is we need to keep this for 6 years. We're retaining this record for 6 years, or it may be something that's a little bit more dependent on events that are happening. But no matter what, after the active stage, we are going to at some point put this record into retention. And after we have waited for the appropriate amount of time in which, for our business use cases, it's unlikely that we're going to be referring back to it anymore. It's basically aged out of our system. It's no longer something we're accessing other than an archival sort of record. It goes into disposition. Now, disposition, we do have a different way of either handling this record through destruction or accessioning it. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But let's go back to that cutoff stage, that gray arrow between our active stage and retention. How do we actually know that a record is no longer active? Now, there are a few parameters that softwares like Laserfiche allow you to define, but there is a little bit of parsing from the information that you get. You may receive a policy that says, I need to hold on to this account document for 6 years, like we mentioned before, or maybe we're waiting for someone to retire, and after they retire, then we'll go ahead and place this record in retention for a length of time. Cutoff instructions can be incredibly variable depending on the type of document that you're working with, but we have different ways of defining that cutoff. So for example, you could say that a record is eligible to be cut off, to be placed into that retention state at the beginning of every fiscal year. Or it could be that, every January 1st, we are ready to archive the documents and place them into retention from the last calendar year. That is a time-based cutoff instruction. That's pretty straightforward. At a certain time in every year, this record that you're dealing with is now eligible to be placed into retention. We are no longer actively working on those documents once we've made it into that next cycle. You could have an opposite sort of instruction. We don't know when this specific event is going to happen, but once it does, that record is no longer active. So as an example, you may have student records. Students graduate at a certain point, but that can be a variable sort of journey. So based off of that event of their student graduation, after that graduation is really when that record is now inactive and ready for retention. So you can imagine that in your own organization, you do have different combinations of these types of cutoff instructions. So as a business analyst, it is your role to tease apart the different components of these instructions and find out what they actually mean in a repeatable rule, rather than just based off of someone's knowledge of when things are ready to be placed in retention. We also have the ability to define cutoff in a more countdown sense. So maybe you have to hold on to something that's active for 24 months before you move on. That's actually pretty easy to define for our users here. You have a record. It is something that you can work on for 2 years before it becomes inactive. This is how we'll define our cutoff instruction. So that's how we get from stage active to stage retention. Now, between retention to disposition, that's all of the information that you're defining in how long you're retaining something. But at the end of that retention stage, you are faced with what you're going to do with this record. So for our disposition actions, we have destruction, and accession. And the other one that I didn't mention is kind of a silent option here, is that you could do nothing at the end of a retention stage, but that's not something I'd necessarily recommend, because that means that you're keeping things indefinitely. That is an option for some people. You do have to keep certain records indefinitely. You know what those look like, but it should be something that's very important. Not just every record that's ever generated in your organization is going to be kept indefinitely. So that really leaves us with the other two options, which are to destroy this record or to accession it. And by destruction, there are other considerations at play here. It's not just deleting an entry name within your file server or within Laserfiche. There's actually ways that you want to make sure this is truly destroyed. So that means in Laserfiche, at least, secure destruction, overwriting the location in the file volumes multiple times. If you're working with physical records, destroying it should be done in a way that you actually cannot piece things back together. For accession, what accession means is that you are transferring the authority for these records to someone else. So this is a pretty specific use case. It's usually only in very regulated government use cases or other regulated industries, but accession is where you hand over your records and now someone else is in charge of managing them. So most of the time for our organizations, we're usually looking at, okay, destruction, or we're going to do nothing. And like I mentioned, doing nothing is fine if it's what you have planned for and it's very intentional, but I would advise people to not default to, at the end of our retention, we're going to do nothing. Now, within records management, another consideration is, all right, great, I have a planned schedule for where these records need to go. What happens if something happens outside of my control that means I need these documents to stay here and not proceed through their defined life cycle? And that's something that we usually see referred to as a hold or legal freeze, and they're usually referred to as legal holds because it's usually for a compliance reason that we cannot get rid of this document, even though the rules tell us that right now that's what we should be doing. So a legal hold allows the retention schedule to be put on pause in some way. So this might be something you build into your process within Laserfiche. This is a native part of the software, but this is, as I mentioned, usually in the context of something like an audit or litigation, because if your retention policy is built correctly, it should account for normal daily usage. If you have too many exceptions to that rule that is defined, where people are needing to hold on to things, that's not usually for a legal reason. It's because the policy maybe does not match the actual use case for a record. But a legal hold is an exception to the rule. It prevents a record manager from accidentally destroying something according to the policy when someone lets us know that we need to hold on to it. So it's a little bit abstract, so I'm going to go ahead and play this video of what this looks like in Laserfiche. And I'm on a record in Laserfiche, and I'm adding a reason why something should be placed on hold. And this is going to prevent people from accidentally going through and seeing it as something that's eligible to be destroyed and getting rid of it. We can also stack multiple holds on top of the same hold that was already applied, because this will allow us to ensure that even if a legal team is using a record for multiple reasons, just because someone lifts one hold doesn't mean that it's ready to go back into its life cycle. So again, a hold is meant as an exception to a rule. It is not meant as a general prevention of records management from being enforced. Now, for the purposes of today's webinar, I have been talking about records management sort of in a way that assumes some transition to a digital standpoint, but that's not always true. We have a lot of organizations that are straddling both physical and electronic documents for a variety of reasons. Well, now with our physical records, I think for us in the technology sector or in some kind of IT role is very easy to understand why you would not want physical content, but there are also just sometimes going to be records that will be physical. You know, it could be for archival reasons. We want to hang on to these tangible pieces of information, less so because we're referencing them every day, but because they are tangible records of history, perhaps. With physical records, of course, the problem here is that you require someone to go and file them. And if you need to find them again, it is a lot harder, especially if you have shipped them off somewhere to a third-party storage location for them to manage your records. Getting a record back isn't simply walking over to a filing cabinet, opening it up, and finding exactly what you need. With physical records, of course, there's also the issue that they take up a lot of space. With our Laserfiche customers, a lot of reasons why people even start going on that digital records management journey is because they're just tired of having rooms that are filled up with filing cabinets. And that's also a liability in terms of emergency and disaster recovery. Recovering paper documents is a lot harder in a lot of respects when we're talking about actual environmental damage. But the one really good thing to take from physical records is that there is a lot of way to enforce centralized control. You can have someone be in charge of filing them and administering them in a very, very consistent manner. For electronic records, we obviously gain the ability to automatically file things away. Backup and recovery can be just a part of our general strategy for our organization for disaster recovery and all of those other concerns, but it does require some individual user engagement. So that's one thing to consider is, you know, a lot of people are moving towards electronic records, especially in today's climate where we need to be able to access our content, even if we're working from home or if we're out in the field. So with our electronic records, they offer so many advantages, but it is going to be a consideration with how are you going to manage that process so that individual users are able to participate in records management, make sure that things are filed away properly without having to become a records manager themselves. So that feeds into how we implement records management. How do we design things that are easy for our business users who could sometimes honestly care less about enforcing records management policy, but have it still feed into our compliance needs and make sure that for our records management folks, they have that added benefit of knowing that these business processes that we create and optimize are optimized for both sides. And one of those questions, again, that I continually return to is, you know, is this records management discovery process part of a process itself, or is it actually applied to something that's an output from someone else? Basically, who is the customer as you are the business analyst? Who is the customer that you're serving here? Is it for a different department that just happens to create content that is of interest to our compliance team to handle in a records management format? Or are you embarking on optimizing a process for records managers themselves? This does affect the design of the overall system that you are working with. So first, I'm going to show you an example of an automated process that we've designed for our records management standpoint. So having a business process that actually allows other users to request those legal holds and put things on hold without having to be a records manager. So for our records management teams, they might be interested in actually optimizing a business process that allows other people to interact with them, to request holds, to request records in a way that's easier. So in Laserfiche, we can use a business process to automatically place things on hold based off of search results and ensure that people are going to be able to work with the system in a way that doesn't require them to know the naming, all of the classification types of all the files that they might be looking for. So building a process to actually shore up the interaction between our business users and our records managers is something that we've seen. Now, on the other hand, we could be gathering requirements for a different business unit. And so with that in mind, you as a business analyst, since you have this records management perspective now, you may know that there's information that they might not be considering as they're outlining their requirements that will make it easier to enforce records management policies after the fact. So here in the requirements gathering and design stage, it is important to kind of take a look at what is actually being generated by the process you're working on. So the example that I'll be talking about in the next few minutes is contract management, right? So for contract managers, actually it is fun because that's usually on the legal side, and legal team probably also has some considerations for compliance usually as well. But in this case, their initial goal for optimizing a process for contract management might not necessarily be targeted at the records management component of the process, right? So they're interested in streamlining how to intake contract requests, draft contracts, and send them out for signature and everything else on that side of the house. But as a business analyst, you know that this process is going to create documents that will definitely be subject to some kind of records management policy. So that means that you can go in there and know that you want to consider documents, how long they need to be kept. You know, you're creating contract documents and there might be a policy in place already that you need to implement within this process, even though that's not the primary focus of what you're there for. The other part of this is that within a process, there are often different dates that are created, different process steps between our different users. In our contract example, that would be things like the execution date or the expiration date of our contract. And those might be important pieces for you to know because, again, if we think back to our records life cycle, going between an active stage and a retention stage does have some kind of cutoff, and that might be dependent on those different pieces of data that are natively being collected within your process. So you don't need to duplicate that. You can simply point to that information and instead know that you might be using it to apply the records management process as well. So with that example, let's go ahead and take a look at a contract management process where, again, records management might not be the forefront in discovery, but as we're signing the process, as we're wrapping up this automated process within Laserfiche, where we are going ahead and having people sign a process, and from our end user perspective, this is where our process leaves off. As the business analyst, you know that from the records management side, this is where we're really kicking off almost a sub-process to go ahead and take care of our records management needs inherently while our business users are getting the automated pieces that they are looking for. So we've completed a user task, and within our automated workflows in Laserfiche, we've actually turned this contract folder into a record automatically. And we've applied a cutoff instruction of our fiscal year and contract ended. So it's a more complex sort of phase. How do we know, again, that this contract is no longer active and going into retention? We are going to look at when the fiscal year ends and also that the contract has ended at a certain time. Then we're going to hold it for 7 years, and then we're going to archive it and we're going to accession it. So that means that we're going to go ahead and, you know, hang on to this for a little while as a contract document. But all of this has happened without the attention of our business user, who is more interested in making sure that they get enough information to fill out a contract, that they get the signatories that they need to send the contract to. This records management consideration is a part of the process, but it might be something that is not inherently uncovered during your initial requirements gathering with only the business users. So what does that look like on our end? So in Laserfiche, we use BPMN to map out our processes. So what you're looking at here is the tail end of our contract signing piece. So we are not going through entire processes today. That's an entire webinar in and of itself. But what I do want to point out here is that within Laserfiche, what we're doing is we're using user tasks to send out actions to our business users. But at the very last step, when we execute the contract, we're actually handing over that information to a document workflow in our system that goes ahead and assigns cutoff instructions and sets our retention schedule in an automated fashion. So why have we done this? Well, from our business user standpoint, that was really our BPMN flow that was going through and outlining the different process stages and the steps for different stakeholders. They're on our business user side. For our records managers, they're more interested in automatic compliance with the filing structure and classification applied as intuitively as possible, not having the person who's drafting a contract also need to know what retention policies apply to it. So in knowing that we have this need to apply records management to the outputs of this process, we're able to account for it in our process design. So that's process design. There are a couple of other things I want to mention in terms of records management and your role as a business analyst. So for migrating your content, we've been talking again a lot about electronic documents, and that best case scenario is that we've been keeping track of these different policies since the beginning of time, and that we've filed them away in a way that makes it very easy to just transfer them into another system to manage that retention policy. But all of us know that that is never quite the case. So when you are doing migration, do consider these aspects that as a records manager you might consider, but from a business user that is just asking you to migrate content into another system, you might not immediately think about. So for migrating data, no matter what system it's in, whether it's Laserfiche or you're going from your file server to another system of record, you do want to consider whether you actually want to migrate all of the information you possibly have. If you have information that has already met that retention length, you've already kept it for as long as you are supposed to, it is worth examining whether you need to migrate that content in. Now, you might be in a situation where you need to keep a record of that record, which is a little bit meta, but it is something that needs to happen occasionally, where you need to prove that you have, in fact, taken care of this record and you have destroyed it, but you have a record of that exchange. Then it might be a consideration where you do migrate everything over. The other thing to consider is from the perspective of if you're trying to centralize all of your content or apply a standardized sort of records management policy across all of the information that you have in your organization, there are many other places where records may live. So one challenge is definitely, as a business analyst, kind of uncovering where it's important to keep things that may have lived in email for a number of years. Network drives are very, very common, of course, where people may just stash items. Organizations, departments may have a very sophisticated system in their network drives of how they are storing content and classifying it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are enforcing the destruction and of a records management policies either. So that's one thing to consider is, of course, as we migrate between softwares, we have softwares that are aging out, we need to move the content elsewhere. You do also want to check all of those other places for things that are considered records. And finally, you do want to make sure that when you store and organize content, even though that can take a lot of time elucidating what exactly business users want and need, they should be classified in a way where records managers could also find that information. So I think one thing that is a large takeaway is that because these are usually two different sets of people, even though our business users own their data, our records managers may approach finding that information in a different way. So one thing that we've done is use shortcuts. One thing that usually is not a great idea is duplicating content for separate groups of people, because that just adds a literal double of the set of information you need to regulate through records management policy. So usually what we have seen is using shortcuts to link people to what they need to see, or building queries in a way makes it easy for both groups to find what they're looking for. So I'll go ahead and show you one final example of what we can do with a process to automate the records management component. And here, let's say that as an HR employee, I am kicking off a notification process for someone who's retiring. You can go ahead and use an electronic form, route it through all of the different notification and approval. But on the records management side, what we're also taking care to do is, oh, we know that this information is going to be relevant to the employee files that we're keeping as records. So while it's a business process in and of itself, the records management component being able to now say, we have that piece of information about this HR file, let's go ahead and place it into retention automatically. Laserfiche can do that. You can also build your processes and other systems to make sure that you are capturing and leveraging content across the board in this regard. So that's just another example of a way that you can have a process that captures the need for both your business users, also records management. And that's because through the discovery, as a business analyst, you have aligned that information and know that you can leverage it for both. So key takeaways, again, we've talked about this throughout this webinar today, but I think it's important as a business analyst, not necessarily to fully immerse yourself in the records management world, but at least to keep records management policies and procedures at the back of your mind with every process that you're looking at. Even if the business use case isn't defined as records management and someone coming to you and telling you that, this is in fact something that we are interested in, I think knowing what information is necessary for records management also allows you as a business analyst to make some smart optimizations in terms of both the business process and also ensuring compliance and not having to come in and consider records management policies further down the road. So partnering this information with records management allows you to be more future facing as a business analyst as well, because the compliance portion is something that we continually see, and it's a lot easier to collect that information up front as part of a business process than retroactively apply it later, even though that is, of course, very possible. So hopefully what you've taken away from this webinar today is a bit of information about general records management practices, but also some ideas for applying it to business processes, even when the people who come to you first aren't from the compliance team, but are from a different business use case. So with that, I'll go ahead and leave you with some next steps. So you can go ahead and reach out to me at Laserfiche. Again, my name is Anita. I'm the pre-sales manager there, but we also have a lot of resources dedicated to records management, and we have a complete guide, the ultimate guide, we call it, for records management as an ebook that you can download and access for free. We also focus very heavily on records management at Laserfiche. So that's something that you can go check out. If that's a process that you're going through as a business analyst right now with your organization, there's a lot of different ways to implement records management and also to approach it in your existing processes. So with that, I'll go ahead and leave these resources up on the page here, and the PowerPoint that we've gone through is also available as a handouts, and I'll turn it back over to Leva.
Thank you so much, Anita. This was a really thorough presentation on records management, so we really appreciate it. The first question I have, which could be on everyone's mind, is as a BA, how can I get started with records management?
Absolutely, and that's a great question. I think for a lot of BAs, you're not necessarily only working on behalf of the compliance team, the legal team, and so having the records management needs in your mind is a good place to start. And I think learning about records management, there's a lot of the ISO standard is pretty clear and concrete, and they have actually advice for planning those policies. I think for records management, it is a pretty unique situation because you can run into it without trying too hard in basically any aspect of the organization. So how do you get started with records management? I think in any process it is important to reach out to other stakeholders, like I mentioned, that might not be present at the table initially because they might not think that it is part of their process, but collaborating with the compliance team to ensure that whatever processes you're using also stack up against what they're needing to find later. For records management, it is also possible to just be very involved on that side as a process expert in that subject matter. For example, I know IIBA is an organization that deals a lot with records management, and they have many practices for archiving and records management in general. So would also take a look there. For getting started with records management, I think a lot of the times it is just building it in and being conscious of it in the processes that you're working on, and working with your team to find out what requirements are there and outlining those different procedures for people to follow, even if you're not necessarily using a software that takes care of all those steps for you. So again, you can kind of find yourself in records management as part of a process. You can reach out to other people in your organization to make sure that you are sort of complying with it. You might have a policy and not be aware of it. And also you can do a lot more research on records management themselves, starting with our ebook, which outlines a lot of common sort of requirements that are there, but spreading it as a practice through your organization is a lot of change management and working with the right people to ensure that we are kind of starting to keep our content in either a centralized way or keeping track of our content in a centralized way.
Right, these are concrete steps. Thank you. Talking about the disposal of information, I think at the beginning of the presentation, you talked about that. What if the disposal of information has to be all of a sudden, has to be used in the near future? And the example here is about commands and queries that somebody cannot remember. So what would you do?
Yeah, so that is always a little bit complicated, right? Because if we have destroyed content, the goal is to destroy it so thoroughly you cannot bring it back, because that would, if you were able to bring it back, that means we haven't destroyed it. So in general, I would say for that one specific use case, if you found that you destroyed it and you can't find it again, what that means is you should really be taking a look at that destruction policy. And if you find that you're constantly accessing things, or trying to access them, but you have already destroyed, that usually means that your policy is not long enough. So the other thing to mention is that usually what we see is that there is kind of an intermediate stage between something being active and it going away all of a sudden. So that retention stage should be long enough to serve as a reference. If it's things like commands and queries, that sounds more to me like reference material that might be something you want to keep in general. If it's general practice information. For records, it usually is something that's a little bit more specific to one transaction. So keeping an archive of learning and resources might be different than applying a destruction policy to records that are specific to a particular project you've worked on or something like that.
Great, thanks. So the next question, we have a couple of questions about Laserfiche as a tool.
Mm-hmm.
A person mentioned, what is the difference between Laserfiche and SharePoint? Another one is around the industries and the records that the industries specifically, historical records management. So there are two questions, I would say. So how does it compare with other tools? And the other question is, does Laserfiche does Laserfiche cover all industries? Like, is it being used in all industries?
Yeah, those are both excellent questions. And the first one is actually one we get a lot. What is the point of having both Laserfiche and or SharePoint? And SharePoint does have records management components within it. I believe they have a records center. The one thing to note that for Laserfiche, we are designed as Department of Defense certified records management system, which means that the way we've implemented records management is with the United States Department of Defense outlined requirements, and it is in place. So basically, with the records management in Laserfiche is a native part of the content repository, which means that you do have the ability to govern the information as it's being created and worked on, and as it's flowing through a process. So it's not a separate component where you sort of export out your information to be managed somewhere else. So Laserfiche serves as your content repository and has the records management functionality natively built in. Now, in terms of what industries are using Laserfiche, we're pretty industry agnostic, actually, but there are a few that we do have very strong established presence in. One of those is especially state and local government. Like I mentioned, we are DoD 5015.2 certified, which is basically the records management certification of note. So for that reason, we are present in very highly regulated industries. So in there, we've got state and local government, which I've mentioned. We are in a lot of education spaces as well as financial services industries. We have a growing presence in healthcare and manufacturing, but essentially, what Laserfiche does is we do have some templatized processes for people to get started with, and our solution providers often access more of that information as well, but we are designed to be a tool set that is configurable, so almost like a box of building blocks.
Perfect. Another question is around, have you ever faced a situation when a user had a request that is not feasible for regulatory reasons?
Yes. One of the requests actually that's more common is that we should keep things, like I mentioned, one of the biggest change management items that we see is that users are often very protective of their data. You know, it's very understandable. They've worked hard on the content that they've put there, or, you know, they are worried that they're going to come back and it's not accessible for whatever reason. So the biggest issue actually that we see is a lot of people want to keep their content forever. And so from an IT standpoint, you know, you may say, well, storage is cheap, you know, that's not really a problem here. We can always just store everything forever. But to that, I say management of the storage is not cheap. For the other component, people want to keep things forever because what if they need it again? Well, there's actually a lot of regulatory reasons why you do not want to be found hanging on to things forever, especially if you're able to dispose of things previously. So that one is a challenging conversation. And again, it may just be establishing procedures that make the user feel comfortable. So again, putting in some layers of approval. In Laserfiche, we do not automatically destroy anything ever, unless, you know, someone customizes our software to do that, but we do not inherently automatically destroy, because that is something that makes people A, feel very uncomfortable, and B, can go very wrong very quickly, as business analysts can imagine. You know, if you set something up slightly incorrectly, you do not want a system automatically destroying. But to get back to my point, putting in layers of approval where they're able to see the content that's being destroyed, seeing the policies that are not just randomly made up by their internal teams. I think those are steps that we can take to make our end users more comfortable when they don't necessarily want to comply. But at the end of the day, records management is so important for ensuring compliance, because like I mentioned, you know, there are actually negative externalities if you keep things for too long, because if you know, it comes up in e-discovery, you know, you may be liable to you know, participate in litigation because you had a record even though you were supposed to destroy it 12 years ago or something like that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And that's all the time we have for questions. And we will get back to you if we did not have a chance to respond to your question. But again, for more information, and you can reach out to Anita and download the ebook and visit the website. And if you're looking for the recording will be available within 10 business days on our website archives. And once again, thank you so much, Anita. We really appreciate your time, and this was a great presentation. And for everybody attending, thank you so much. Wherever you are, have a good afternoon and good weekend.
Thank you so much, Leva.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.